Today, as we know, we have Richard with us. Richard, thanks a lot for being here. We are so excited to have you here. As you know, for the last 20 or so years, NPS it's been part of corporate strategy across big companies, small companies, across all different sectors, and we've seen more and more companies adopting Net Promoter in Latin America and Spain. So it's so great to have your expert conversation with us. So many thanks for being here. It's great. Maybe I want to start with a question that has to do with strategy, with CX strategy. So I would say, as much as it may seem obvious, CX goes to the heart of business sustainability. Yet, every day we are asked for help from CX professionals with questions such as, how can I show finance guys the business case of my CX investments? So they are asking us, is this really a good business? Is providing a great customer experience a good business? So people are still struggling with the business case. What would be your take on this, Richard?
So I think there are two different ways to sort of answer the question whether or not it makes sense to invest in customer experience. And let's think of one as being a sort of macroeconomic answer and one being a bit more specific to the nature of any particular company. So at a macro level, we now have 20 years of data that shows consistently that CX leaders in most industries outperform companies that aren't CX leaders. And that outperformance comes in multiple ways. It comes in growth, it comes in profitability, it can come in cost to serve reductions. And so if we step back and look at the evolution of most industries, we've seen this strong correlation between customer experience leaders and outperformance financially. And so if that's not persuasive enough, and I would argue that at some level, if you see that data, you would argue there's a case for investment. There's an argument at a micro level within companies, and that's usually based on an understanding of, think about the lifetime value difference between customers who are promoters versus who are detractors. And a lot of companies really do analyze out both the revenue, the profitability, and the costs of different customer groups, depending on whether they're promoters or detractors. And they see significant difference between those groups. So again, I think there's a good micro argument at the company level as well as macro. What, of course, we don't know with complete certainty is the causality. Is it the case that customer experience leaders are leaders because they're good at CX? Or are they good at CX because they're just good at everything they do? It's a byproduct of all their operations. But I think it's almost a moot point. What we know is if you're not at the top of your industry in terms of customer relations, customer experience, it's statistically very unlikely you're going to go on and outperform financially. That's pretty solid data.
Yeah, that's correct, Richard. Thanks a lot. I really like so much how you put it in that macro and micro levels. And we've seen with many companies that when they do NPS very, very well, they learn a lot in terms of the business model they are playing it. So for example, value proposition. We stand for your value proposition is not what you say you do for somebody, but is what your customer says you do for them. Does that pop something in your mind of maybe some examples where you see NPS going to the heart of the strategy maybe?
Well, I think that I think one of the fundamental misconceptions around customer experience is that it's all about its impact is all about customers you already have. I think it has a profound impact on customers you're going to have as well. Yep. And that comes through two mechanisms. The first one is that you get a word of mouth effect, right? So we're fully familiar with some spectacular company performances over the last 30 or 40 years that were all word of mouth based, right? If we think about Starbucks coffee, there weren't TV adverts for Starbucks coffee. It grew because people went, they liked the product, they liked the experience, they went to tell their friends about it, and Starbucks grew organically. So we know there's this circular benefit of good customer execution comes back and impacts customer acquisition. But in terms of what you're saying about learning about yourself, I think what the most successful companies do, the companies that have really high performance, is that they really define themselves around a segment of the market that they know they can deliver outstanding experiences to, better than their competition.
Yeah.
Ideally, that's also a segment of the market that they've identified as having high growth potential, high profit potential. And so they orchestrate their customer acquisition, their customer engagement, their customer development around the capabilities that they can demonstrate to customers. And that creates very, very high NPS, very good financial outcomes, rather than worrying about trying to serve customers where their internal capabilities don't align. And you can make a compelling argument that a customer who is a bad fit for your business is simply going to withdraw value from the company over time. It's not going to be a good idea. You're better off not recruiting those customers.
Yeah. No, you're completely right. It goes to the very core of how you are set up to deliver value to whom. Definitely. And we've seen so many challenges here in Latin America and in Spain with companies that are very, very large, and they have, for example, 12 million clients, and they have so many different segments. They are in fact, they are like if you put the population, they just fit perfectly. You see their segmentation, and the population is just a perfect match because of the number of clients they have, and we've been trying to work with them in how is it that you can hardwire the understanding of different segments. We can say archetypes, even moving forward that path, and then set up different teams to serve different types of customers because you have the challenge there, right? When you're massive like these companies.
Right. So I think this is a more pronounced challenge, as you said, for very large enterprises. If you're a startup or early stage, you're going to narrowly define the segments of the market you serve, and you're going to become very good at it. And so you become a big threat to companies, as you described, that try and serve a lot of different customer groups and may not do the best possible job for every one of those segments. If you think about it, we've organized business now, well, since really the end of the Second World War, around functional specialism, right? We have teams that do sales, do marketing, manufacturing. We've really perfected that model of organization. And now we realize that to some degree, the customer-centric view of the universe runs completely across that and is almost in direct conflict with it. So the question you're asking is, how do large corporations reorientate themselves to deal with that? And I think it's not possible for them to simply wake up one day and say, we're restructuring around customer segment-driven thinking, because they have skill sets, disciplines, processes that are completely opposite to that. What I think companies need to do is break down two barriers, both of which I think they can solve. The first one is they need to reorganize their data. They need to start getting data that shows the customer-driven view of the company. And that's obviously what we in the CX industry and you guys are all about. How do we build those customer viewpoint data sets that give us a orientation that's not our internal orientation, that is that customer orientation? And that data set becomes critical. So that becomes step number one. I think step number two is, how do you get the company to start to reorientate itself to solving problems along that sort of data axis? And I think you can do that by better data that aligns people around the customer viewpoint, virtual teams, centers of competence that are organized around particular customer segments, overlay organizational structures. I think companies are trying a lot of different virtual organizational structures, but they're all shooting for the same thing, which is how do we get our teams to look at customer-oriented data, to collaborate across functional boundaries to solve customer problems?
Yep.
And how do we then strategically, as a leadership team, allocate resources to that segment of the customer marketplace that we're going to absolutely delight and are going to be high performance financially as well? How do we make those choices? And I'd leave one thought on that topic. It's really a portfolio question. Yeah. How do you allocate resources across your portfolio of customer segments? And I would say to large companies, if you're not proactively making that decision, if you're not organizing yourself, then you're actually making a decision just to evenly distribute resources. That's rarely going to be a winning strategy, I think, over the next decade.
That is so interesting, Richard, the way you're putting it, because one thing we observe every day is that the assumption, the managerial assumption, the normal managerial assumption would be if you maximize the output of every single function, then you will maximize the output of the entire system in terms of the customer experience. Right. But it's not true. It's never true. It's never true because, as I would say, and I'm trying to put what you're saying in my words to see, just to reflect if I'm understanding well. Value, the value construction for our clients does not respect silos, does not respect hierarchies. It just goes across. And yet we are still managing functions and we are not managing journeys.
Think about banking as an example, right? So right now we have in retail banking, obviously COVID has shifted the nature of retail banking in a very dramatic way in a very short period of time. There's been massive investment in digital technology. But if you step back for a second, you've got a demographic in retail banking that still thinks of physical banks as where they do business. And they think about going into a bank. And they think about interpersonal relationships with another human being. You've got a generation who thinks that their smartphone's a bank. And for them, by the way, their smartphone is a bank. And there are new entrants into banking that are telecommunications companies, that are software companies. And aside from some regulatory challenges, these companies are becoming extremely adept at building relationships with a younger demographic who conducts all their business on a mobile phone. So we clearly see significant distinctions between demographics in what they want out of functions, IT-centric versus location-centric. But each customer segment values these different components in very, very different ways. And they don't value everything evenly. They don't value the contact center versus the branch versus the digital product in the same way. So we can't simply optimize at a functional level. We have to think about optimizing at a customer segment level.
Yeah, that's completely correct. And I think that goes to the heart of a challenge that CX people have every day. We CX people have every day. And normally we hear it's been really, really hard in my company to get all these people to pay attention to the score, to the NPS, and then to promote the system, right? And then to act in consequence. And I say, okay, because they have a number that they have to achieve, they have a goal, a functional goal, and this is like another different goal. And I think NPS has brought to the table a very, very productive way of measuring success. So not only your P&L, not only your function success, but your success is actually what the customer says, and that is NPS. I think that helps a lot. What would be your take on that, Richard?
I think that's right. You know, another way of thinking about this is through the lens of time. In some ways, financial results are all retrospective, right? Every quarter we publish financials, and it's what happened last quarter or what's happened over the last year.
Yeah.
In opposition to that, I would argue that NPS is a forward-looking metric. You're really taking a glimpse into the future. What are customers going to do in the future? Your presumption is that promoters are going to buy more, expand, detractors are going to contract. So any executive running a company has a mandate to achieve short-term financial performance, but also look to the future. And so both these metrics need to be held in some degree of balance. If you have a very low or underperforming NPS business and a strong financial performance, what that's telling you is your future's not as bright as your past. And the reverse is true as well. Now, holding two goals like that together is challenging for everybody.
Yeah.
I would argue that at a leadership team level, it shouldn't be challenging. We should be expecting executive teams to be able to take care of the future as well as the present. That's kind of what they're paid to do.
Yeah.
When I think it comes down to employees in the organization, it's worth remembering that in many instances, they are motivated more by the culture of the company and the leadership objectives than they are by the tactical measures that are put on them. So the technique that works better often for employees is to educate them on the benefits of being CX driven. Try and engineer the culture of the company to do the right thing. Look, you don't get these companies that are superb with NPS because we pay people to do it. We get it because it becomes sort of the family rules for the company. This is the culture of the company. And so I think that for rank and file employees, leadership needs to educate on the value of customer experience, establish this as how the company's going to operate, reinforce proper behavior, all the good things that we think would change or influence people.
Yeah, definitely. I will take these comments and tie that to in the NPS Global Certification, the masterclass. You talk about in the first part you talk about the science, and the second part is the art, and I think that is so accurate because what you are saying right now combines both. So we have the science of getting really good data and the science of how we tie that to business performance now, but there is an art behind that into transforming that into a corporate culture based on what is really good for the customer and how you actually go to the heart of the culture and get people to perform. You were saying just now, not because you pay them for that, but because that's how we perform. That's what we do here.
Right, and I think customer experience has always been an exercise in organizational change more than anything. I think most programs might cosmetically point to success or failure based on data. But I think if you look behind that, what you see is an organizational dynamic. It's an act of leadership. I don't think it's a default that companies do the right thing to optimize CX. I don't think that's where they start. I think it requires leadership. I think, whereas to say, financially, do companies do the right thing? Well, that's the default, right? I think that's what we all understand. You're not going to have leadership teams say we don't care about financials. So I think it is about organizational engagement and change. It is about leadership. It's not always comfortable. I think what people don't like is necessarily to learn that their products, their services aren't perhaps as appreciated by customers as they might want them to be. And that's an uncomfortable conversation. But I think good leaders recognize that kind of conversation can create breakthroughs. And so they're ready to take on the organizational shift. And that is, as you say, more of an art than a science to get people to change. Yeah,
no, totally. And I think the key question is not only to get results, as you're saying, that is a default thing. You've got to get results. But how do you get results? Because that is quite challenging. It's not only getting a profit. You can get a profit just, maybe getting away with some things that go against customers.
Right.
You can do that. You can do that. You can be quite profitable. We know many companies that actually are quite profitable in that way, but they are, right? So and here comes maybe an argument of, okay, is it really a good? Is really good business? Delivering really good CX, and I think that is all about sustainability first of all, because there is going to be a disruptor. Sooner or later is going to be a disruptor in your industry, and you have to stay ahead of the game.
I love your comment about sustainability, because I think that really is the relevant point. If we only care about right now, we can operate a business in many different ways. But if we want to build a sustainable business, we're not going to be able to do it if we don't have high levels of customer engagement and loyalty.
Yeah.
And depending on the nature of your market, there is going to be shocking levels of disruption. And, if you look at the fintech evolution from the last 5 or 6 years, fintech companies now have something in the order of 20% of the total market capitalization in North America of financial services, 20%. So the market has decided that these challengers are eroding the share of market capitalization of the bigger traditional institutions. And this is an industry which is actually relatively well protected against innovation. I mean, there are regulations to start with that make it hard for new companies to innovate. And so what you see here is, if you don't delight your customers, innovators will come. They will be highly capitalized. They will come from places that might surprise you. I look at many parts of the world where mobile money has been transformative in the space of the last 5 or 6 years. And this has happened in parts of Indonesia, in sub-Saharan Africa, where unbanked populations suddenly get access to banking services via their phone, the smartphone, often even a feature phone. And so the banks suddenly realize that this is their competition. And they've already lost a good deal of market share to innovators who focus on delighting customers with these new products. So I think it's a long-term business imperative for companies to understand how they're going to compete against innovation. And the best way to do that is to build a fortress around your customers by providing them with products and services that they love. And they won't go. They'll be very sticky.
Yeah, totally. If we go back, because I'm imagining the audience right now saying, yeah, that's correct. How do I do that? I'm thinking about, people, because it's all plausible and it's all, coherent. And then, as always, the strategy, when you try to implement, then you have an issue. Then you have, the hard work is just implementing CX. You were saying, and I completely agree. Sometimes I believe that we just disguise ourselves into CX, but what we really do is trying to re-engineering the management way of doing businesses sometimes, because you have, if you want to do really good CX, you have to break down silos, you have to maybe question some metrics, some KPIs, some types of leadership. You have to help in those ways if you really want the organization to move forward into a more customer-centric team as a whole.
Well, and look, it's like every transformational initiative, there are leadership techniques that are involved, right? I think smart leaders understand that transformation is going to be somewhat abrasive. You're going to have to set up structures that run against the way the company traditionally thinks, that drive things forward. And you're going to have to find leaders who are not just enthusiastic about the concept, but have the skills that are ideal for being able to actually drive transformation. But these are very well-established management practices. I would say that CX, through its evolution, has actually evolved a new set of opportunities and challenges. And the challenges come from the fact that we have over the years focused on collecting data and analyzing it. And I think programs make a lot of progress at first like that, but then they become somewhat static. They get into a bit of a habit, and they start to go through a ritual of obtaining data. People start to tune it out. The sort of initial rush of learning about where you stand as a business gets dissipated, and people just get fatigued of looking at the numbers once every month, once every quarter. And so a lot of companies have to recognize that to be successful at CX is a constant effort at innovation. And that's innovation in terms of the types of data they can use and gather, the kinds of insights they want to implement. They need to keep changing things up. If it like any change initiative, if it stalls, it dies. And I think too often the initial zeal and the enthusiasm fades over time because they don't keep it fresh. And there are techniques to do that. And there are a lot of processes that can be used. But I'm sure you've seen this in your clients as well. If they don't energize this constantly, what happens is it loses momentum, and essentially it becomes part of the everyday, and it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be a constant challenge to change.
Totally. Yeah, and if I go back to the certification process, when we talk about the art, and you say, I remember one of your very, very accurate words saying, okay, data is your most valuable assets in the program. So you've got to have really, really good data, because we see many programs that they don't have really good data. When I say good data, I just come down to actionable, trustworthy data, and in the correct hands. So it's really interesting. I really love that in that certification you have placed so much effort into data, and not only there, but then you have all this instruction, all these techniques on how you communicate data. So how you do storytelling. That is so awesome in the program. I really, really like that, because I've seen, as much as I've seen not so good data, but good enough, but then they communicate that very poorly. And then when you tell the story, you have all these, all the way from leadership to the people actually executing every day, they just do not engage with the voice of the customer, but just because how you're telling it.
Well, we're not, as human beings, terribly well engineered to process data. Right, we've got a billion years of evolution that teaches us how to process anecdotes and stories, and maybe 30 or 40 years that say we should look and understand data. So we're really bad at this, and I think that in general, companies are working very hard to improve their degree of data literacy and build generations of management that are very data orientated, but that takes time. Now, don't get me wrong. I think at the end of the day, beyond just CX, data literacy, ability to make data-driven decisions, is going to dominate future success for companies. The companies that have, as you say, substantial data assets, that are really capable of deploying them, are going to beat companies that aren't very soundly. And the gap between companies that are data asset rich and those that aren't is expanding rapidly. Because CX data now is a much bigger data set. It's not just data that's obtained through traditional mechanisms like surveying, it's data that's obtained through all contact center interactions, through all kinds of operational data sets in the business, through the whole data exhaust that the customer leaves. And so what was good data asset development 20 years ago is now a fraction of what's required to be competitive in those grounds. So companies that have stayed at the front edge of building out great data assets are now increasingly better than companies who haven't. That gap is opening up. The second point you made, I think, which is, how do we use data to actually glean insight? And I think there is a distinction between data and insight. You know, in many ways, I like to think of analytics as a process of transforming data into something that supports decisions. Because at the end of the day, we want to make decisions. That's our end point.
Yep.
And there is merit to just reporting and tracking data. If you look at data over time, you can see how people respond to that data. But we need to become much better at thinking through what are we learning about our customers from the data. And that's a whole different level of tools and a whole different level of data processing capability. And then, as you said, all of that data-oriented insight into narratives that human beings can perceive and take to heart. And you know, you can't show 20,000 employees 100 slides and say, there you go off and do your job. That's not as powerful what the data that you've developed.
Yeah, completely. Like how in the certification, you just take this approach of analytics into two different phases. So the one is exploratory data, and the other one is descriptive. So that is a huge difference. And I think leadership should be really, really aware of that, because when you show NPS data to leadership, sometimes they just take it for granted. And I think a key question would be, are we exploring what our customers feel, describe? Are we still in the process of discovering key drivers? Or do we already know key drivers and we are describing how we are performing in those drivers in each very important customer journey touch point, for example? So these phases are so different. We have to be very, very aware of, are we exploring, understanding, still understanding? We do not understand today. That is such a good question, because then you focus more your analysis on that.
I think that's right. And you know, the other thing we need to do, and I think it's a challenge for us all in the CX community, is to speak a business language to leaders, right? We can't walk in and talk about statistics and data and analytics without triangulating it back to the business language the company wants to understand, right? And I think that the best professionals for running CX programs can do both. They can take the data and they can turn it into business direction. I think your point about exploration, look, I think most innovation comes from surprising, unexpected insight. You know? I think that you know, the old joke was that there's few eureka moments. More likely, people say, "What on earth was that?" Right? It's a surprise, and I think that when we're looking through data, we should be looking for what is unusual, what is surprising, what is not in line with our assumptions, because that's typically where we get the most useful insights from. No doubt there'll be some confirmatory data. There'll be instances where what we learn is what we already knew coming in. But we always want to be a little bit cautious when the data tells us what we expect it to say, because we want to be careful that we haven't read that bias in already. And we haven't simply imposed our own bias on the data and said, oh, look, it tells us what we already thought.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, leadership should be very, very aware of cognitive biases. If you actually Google cognitive biases, you'll find
a long list.
Long list. Definitely. We should be aware of that. And we say, if we just turn the conversation, Richard, into action, because what we say is you have to NPS is all about understanding in order to take action. And action, NPS, it's been really, really good as a methodology. It evolved from the score to the system. And this evolution is, I think, one of the processes that I really, really value a lot is the closed loop system. And the first one of just coming back to a client and saying, thanks a lot for what you said. I learned a lot. I know you have these issues. I'm going to take care of it. So this short circle of just coming back to the client and just recovering detractors, it seems very, very tactical thing. In the years I've learned, it's so strategic, because when you go back to each and every client, every detractor, you learn so much in the process. Right. Takes you to think about the customer more and more.
Well, I think it's probably one of the most obvious things with hindsight, but as you said, one of the most powerful things. Look, first of all, if a customer gives you feedback, you have a responsibility to respond to it.
Yeah.
They've invested their time in telling you something about your business. What are you going to do? Just ignore it? And if you do, of course, the customer will say, well, great, I put my time into telling you this. You did nothing with it. I'm not going to do that again. So really what we're doing is we're establishing a dialogue with customers. We're asking them what they think, and we want them to be honest. And we want them to tell us exactly what they think of our performance. And we want them to sort of break that out in ways that help us understand how to improve. And in return, we're going to engage with the dialogue with them. And that dialogue is partly being gracious about the fact they provided feedback, but partly going back to them and saying, you identified issues, we'd like to do our best to take care of it. Now, the biggest surprise to me over the years is how, first of all, having conversations with unhappy customers is not an unpleasant experience. It's very rarely unpleasant. It's usually an illuminating experience. The customer's usually thrilled that you care enough to have a conversation. And demonstrating to customers that you care creates a tremendous amount of value. You don't have to solve every problem to improve that relationship. Customers will just respond to the fact you're demonstrating you're invested in the relationship. So you get surprising results like that. As you quite rightly said, it's also massively educational, because the conversation you get into always informs your broader picture of the customer. And I think that we should all be seeking ways to get into conversations with customers wherever we can, because we used to call that selling. In some ways, it's the perfect opportunity to work with customers in a collaborative way on a topic they care about, their success, and build a proper relationship.
Yeah, completely. And I think this is very valuable, because closing the loop in this sense, it is a process. It is something you can actually implement. So it would be great just to have all the audience being very, very confident that it's something that you actually implement. You have the metrics, you have management of the process. So it's something it's still good part of it is still on the side of the science, because it is a process, a very well-defined process that you can actually manage very well. And you can have really good tools, both technological and managerial tools, to implement this. So you have a really good achievement there, definitely. And then it comes the art, which is transforming, assumptions, and then processes, and then KPIs, and then all of the rest. So talking about organizational transformation, that is an art, of course. But we have really good insights so far on how very successful NPS players in the world have done that, which in the certification, I think that's adds a lot of value, because you have really good examples. We've seen with our alumni just how they get enlightened with some cases they say, and they just read it and say, first of all, I'm not alone, right? Secondly, there's people that just crossed this path before, learned a lot, and I can learn from that. I can actually learn a lot from it. So in your experience, what would be these critical success factors when you are talking about corporate transformation towards being more customer-centric?
Right. So I think you're spot on in saying, in some ways, what people want to understand is that they're not alone in both the challenges and the opportunities that they have, right? So I would say, two things on the overall transformation. The first one is, let's accept from the start that it's hard, right? I think that may sound obvious, but I think sometimes we can throw around words like transformation. It sounds so simple as a textbook. We'll pull it off a shelf and we'll just go and transform our enterprise. It's massively challenging because it requires an awful lot of people to change their behavior. And that's hard. It's hard to change behaviors. It's also a challenge for companies because transformation involves going from a business model that is dialed in, that's operating, to one that is both uncertain and is going to disrupt the way that the company operates. And so that's hard. What I think we know now, having seen corporate transformation around CX for the last 20 years, is that the best way to think about it is this reorientation of the way the company organizes, acts, and analyzes away from a purely functional organization to an organization that looks through the lens of customer segments and customer behaviors. That's a reorientation. Now, I'm not going to say reorganization. I'm not suggesting that companies simply tear up the org chart and head off in a different direction. It's recognizing that you have to be able to operate both ways. You have to be able to operate in a customer-driven viewpoint and a functionally driven viewpoint. Now, that's harder than the functionally driven viewpoint. The good news is there's now better data, technology, tools, and science to support you. But that's at the heart of transformation now, in my experience. Now, I sort of take leadership for granted, because if you don't have the leadership, I don't think you embark on it. But if you do have the leadership, I think that you can reorientate the company, and you're not trying to do a massive pivot necessarily. You're maybe just trying to lean the company in new directions that give it that sort of push towards really making an impact on the customer performance.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe, Richard, I am very aware of your time. Thanks a lot. Maybe the last question would be: you're talking about leadership now, and that is a big topic. In your experience, in 20 years of doing this, surely you know when you come across a client, you know when you have good leadership and when you maybe not so much. You just feel it. I bet you know it. When you observe, when you see some data, when you talk to people, you can tell. You can tell. I'm sure you can tell if there's magic, right? So what do you look for to see if there's leadership? And then just for the sake of, okay, let's see where we are standing and what is it that we have to work on? Because this thing, leadership, maybe we have really good heart to put into it, but maybe we have to deploy, as you said, new behaviors as leaders. So what would be your take on that? How do we know and what we should do to ensure that we have really good leadership in an NPS program?
So I think that leadership is a personality trait in many ways. And what I've observed is that one of the dominant characteristics of successful CX leaders is that they are willing to swim upstream. They are willing to take the organization to a place that it doesn't necessarily want to go to, but a place that it will nevertheless be better off when it gets there. Right? Yeah. I think in some ways it's an exercise in adversity. You could argue if you don't have adversity, you don't need leadership, right? If everyone's going to go there, then it's pretty straightforward. So it really is about that ability to manage adversity, I should say. And I would suggest that on top of that, I think what we see in great leaders for this is that they understand the tools that are at their disposal, and the tools can be organizational, can be incentive orientated, right? How do you establish the right kind of incentive structures? Can be about personnel selection. and then can be about tactics, calling the plays. You know, whenever I think about this, I have to say, I always think about football, by which I mean what we call soccer in the United States here. Because I think that if you look at the best managers, you see all these traits, and we know what leadership is. It's about selection of the team. It's about how they support the team on the field. It's about the tactics they engage. I think in some ways it's very similar. We're looking for the same traits. It's the motivation, the engagement, the tactics, the design.
Yeah.
Look, it's extremely challenging. But what I would say to most companies is that the missing element when there isn't leadership is really the ability to look forward sufficiently, the tendency to focus on the present to the exclusion of the future. And really what we're asking for senior leaders is think about what the future of the business is, or as I think you put it beautifully, how do I build a sustainable business? Because that really is the role of senior leadership at the end of the day.
That is so awesome. Great, Richard. Thanks a lot for being with us for the time. I think we'll have some questions from the audience, so maybe we can just go for that. Thanks a lot, Richard.
Thank you.
Good.
Tengo una pregunta, creo que fundamental. Y nos preguntan cuál es el principal rol del CEO en un proyecto de transformación centrada en el cliente. So Richard, we are having this question. What would you say is the main role of the CEO in a customer-centric transformation?
That's a good question, because what we know from experience is that absent leadership from the chief executive, customer experience transformation doesn't usually happen. And so it's a logical question to ask what exactly do we want CEOs to do around this? Well, let me step back for a second and say that if you think of the main role of the chief executive as creating long-term stakeholder success, and by stakeholder I mean customers, employees, and shareholders, their job in some ways is to make the longer-term decisions that are more challenging to make for the business at the expense of shorter-term choices. Or put another way, if the CEO is not looking long-term, then you've got a real problem that nobody else in the company is likely to be doing so. So I actually would phrase it, and this may seem like a bit of an odd answer, I would say the role of the CEO is to take the actions that the organization won't naturally take, is to do the things that the company doesn't want to do on its own. And that tends to be make more difficult decisions about long-term growth. What are the right kind of customers that the company's going to be successful around? How do we avoid falling into short-term financial traps instead of long-term investments? And how do we build a culture, big word that everyone loves to use, that's going to support that? And so if you look at some of the biggest success stories in CX over the years, they've come from iconic chief executives like Charles Schwab, for example, or Michael Dell, or Jeff Bezos at Amazon, who've basically said, these are principles, we're going to focus long-term, we're going to focus on customer value over time. I don't think it's the CEO's job to figure out the mechanics of this or the details of it, but they want to set the goals and hold the leadership team accountable. And accountability is a big challenge unless you have the right measurements, because if you don't measure correctly, how do you hold the team accountable? So a long answer, but it's a challenging job with multiple aspects in this regard.
Yeah, that's great. Lo que nos comenta Richard ahora es, lo primero es una súper buena pregunta. En primer lugar, porque si hay ausencia de liderazgo o ausencia de CEO en el sentido de un proyecto de transformación, simplemente fracasa. Y creo que el mensaje principal es, el trabajo del CEO es tomar esas decisiones de largo plazo que de otra manera no se tomarían. En tres vertientes principales. La primera es el grupo de clientes que nos van a dar valor a largo plazo. En segundo lugar, es qué tenemos que hacer para apuntalar justamente esa visión en términos de justo de llevar a la gente a donde no necesariamente quiere ir por su propia voluntad. Y si no estuviera el CEO, no se tomarían las decisiones que se tienen que tomar para que vayan para allá. Y en transformar la cultura, como bien dice ahora Richard, se habla mucho de cultura, pero finalmente ahí es donde se apalanca el largo plazo. Entonces, digamos que la ausencia del CEO se notaría mucho cuando no hay visión de largo plazo y cuando se sacrifica el largo plazo por decisiones de corto plazo. Hay unos ejemplos muy, muy claros de Charles Schwab, de Dell, incluso ahora Richard mencionaba Amazon, de cómo dijeron, vamos a hacer una empresa verdaderamente centrada en nuestros clientes en el largo plazo. Básicamente eso creo que es un buen resumen. Todas estas respuestas las vamos a capturar y se las vamos a enviar de manera súper detallada. Mil gracias por las preguntas, es una gran pregunta. Richard nos comenta, no necesariamente el CEO tendrá que ver la implementación de este tema, pero seguro que van a necesitar muy buenas métricas porque un tema clave es la rendición de cuentas. Y si no tienes buenas métricas, la rendición de cuentas es difícil. Estoy viendo aquí una pregunta, hablando de medición, que es muy interesante. La medición es un tema, sabemos que es un tema clave y vemos varias preguntas de medición ahora. Y tenemos una pregunta acá que dice, nosotros en la empresa, ¿no? Somos una empresa de más o menos 5 millones de clientes, y hemos estado midiendo NPS relacional de manera mensual, es decir, tenemos unas oleadas aleatorias mensualmente, y estas oleadas dividimos nuestra base de clientes, mandamos de manera aleatoria a partes de nuestros clientes de manera mensual, y ahí tenemos el NPS relacional, y además tenemos la medición transaccional. Y nos preguntan, ¿esto es una buena manera de que midamos el NPS? Es decir, lo que escucho un poco detrás de esta pregunta es, ¿podemos confiar en esta metodología? So Richard, I'm taking on your past comment on you need accountability, and if you want to have accountability, you've got to have really good metrics. So they're asking us. This is a company with roughly 5 million clients, and they measure relational NPS and transactional. So transactional, they do it like trigger-based transactional. But the relationship NPS, relational NPS, what they do is they are dividing the customer base into 12 tranches, and they send each month to these aleatory emails to this customer base. So they get their relationship measurement each month. So the way they do it is they have kind of a biopsy of the customer base, and they have these waves every month. Do you think that would sum up as good practice for measuring relationship NPS?
I think there's a lot to commend it. The biggest challenge with relationship NPS is the low frequency of the data, and that makes it very hard for the organization to stay engaged. The other challenge is low response rates. But in terms of breaking it up into more frequent cycles like that, I like that as an idea. I think that in general, that maintains more organizational momentum. Of course, how you do that, how you select the right samples to make sure you've got some consistency in the score, and how you use that data becomes very important. But I think it's a move in the right direction, yes.
Yeah, good, thanks. Una respuesta muy puntual de Richard nos comenta, es un reto grande el tema relacional, de la medición relacional. Un poco para contexto de toda la audiencia, la medición relacional es cuando le preguntamos al cliente ¿qué tan dispuesto estarías a recomendarnos? Del 0 al 10 en general, ¿no? La relación general. Y entonces, normalmente estas mediciones tienden a hacerse de manera anual, y eso, Richard decía ahora, es como de baja frecuencia, y eso mantiene un engagement muy bajito, porque claro, no lo tienes vivo. Entonces él dice, en esos términos, medirlo mensual, así como lo está preguntando ahora la audiencia, es una muy buena idea, porque lo mantienes lo mantienes constante, entonces bien, muy bien. El tema de seleccionar las muestras y eso, claro, es sumamente importante, habrá que ver eso, pero bueno, lo más importante es qué hacemos con los datos, ¿no? Eso es lo más importante, qué hacemos con los datos. Entonces, esta es una gran pregunta. ¿Cuáles son los principales desafíos que enfrentan los gerentes para asegurar los recursos en sus programas de experiencia del cliente? ¿Cómo se superan estos retos? Creo que eso es importante. So Richard, what are the main challenges that managers face, in your experience, that they face to secure resources in their CX programs? And do you have any really good tips on how to overcome that, those challenges?
Well, I think that I think there are several. I would start with the most obvious one, which is that a lot of CX programs fail to make a compelling economic case for customer experience. They tend to make a moral case. This is the right thing to do, as opposed to this is the financially attractive thing to do. And companies will invest in the right thing to do, but they're more likely to assign better assets to financially rewarding choices. So I think that there's not enough attention spent on the financial benefits associated with these programs. I think the second mistake that a lot of project leaders do is they significantly undersell what it takes to get the program done. And they're fighting against a mentality that is, well, it's just some survey program we're running. And I think that if you contrast that with, say, digital transformation, no one would come in and say, well, it's just some web pages we're building, right? Everyone understands these are complex, large programs. So they're inadequately scoped up front. There's not enough time spent laying out all of the different aspects to what will achieve success and linking those investments to outcomes. And so I think it's under planning in many instances. And then once you've started the program on a small scale basis with small funds, well, the results aren't very good. And so it sort of reinforces the idea that it shouldn't be funded properly.
Great. Sí, esa es una gran respuesta de Richard. Lo primero que nos comenta es, lo principal es tener el caso de negocio de la lealtad, porque puede haber un caso moral, es decir, hacerlo correcto, y eso puede ser que tenga inversión, ¿no? Puede ser que haga sentido invertir en hacer lo correcto, pero normalmente va a tener mucho más sentido hacer lo que nos va a dar un beneficio financiero. Entonces, dedicarle tiempo al caso de negocio de la lealtad es un tema que hay que trabajar. Eso es lo primero. Lo segundo es que normalmente se subestima lo que implica un programa de experiencia del cliente. Normalmente esto se confunde con hacer encuestas. Richard nos dice, sería lo mismo que decir, es que transformación digital es hacer una página web, cuando pues en realidad transformación digital es todo un proyecto. Entonces, esto nos lleva a decir, bueno, muchas veces estamos subestimando que esto es una transformación que toma tiempo y en ese sentido nos dice, bueno, es un tema muchas veces de no tener suficiente planeación para ver exactamente las implicaciones y qué tenemos que hacer. Ahí tenemos una ventaja, puede ser tener proyectos al inicio de menor escala, que vayan muy bien, demostrar los resultados, irlos creciendo. Pero creo que en el corazón está pues el caso de negocio de la lealtad. Estoy súper pendiente del tiempo, entonces todas las preguntas que ustedes tienen todas las vamos a responder, las vamos a comentar siempre con Richard, las vamos a responder a todo el mundo. Quisiera agradecer muchísimo, se nos acabó el tiempo, muchísimo a todos ustedes por la asistencia. Tuvimos un montón de asistencia, estamos bien contentos con eso, esperamos haberles agregado mucho valor. Le queremos agradecer muchísimo a Isabel Martínez, ¿no? Vicepresidenta de Sostenibilidad y Servicios Corporativos del banco. Mil gracias, Isabel, por gestionar todo el webinar. La audiencia, súper valioso. Richard, thanks a lot for being with us. Gracias, Isabel.
Mil gracias por el espacio, por la generosidad en compartir estas experiencias. La verdad creo que fue un gran contenido para nosotros en el banco y para todos los clientes del Banco Bogotá. Muchas gracias.
Súper, Isabel. Mil gracias a todos. Richard, thanks a lot.
Of course. Thank you.
Okay, bye now.